Uh, Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the last talk of the first semester. I'm sure you'll be looking forward to the talks in the second semester, but for the time being, this will be the last talk. But I also have some good news for you. The last issue of the Journal of American Studies of Turkey has come out. This is it. And this is the 56th issue, by the way, and it is on Asian Americans. So you can find it online as well. So after the commercial, let me move on to introducing our guest speaker. We're very happy to have you, Professor Johnson. Thank you for joining us tonight and giving a talk for us. Let me introduce the professor now. Well, Professor Johnson received his PhD in history from Bilkent University in 2011. His research focuses on the relationship between social development and cultural formation in early America and the early modern Atlantic world. His academic articles have appeared in the journals like Social History, Early American Studies, Cultural and Social History, and Pennsylvania History. And a new article titled Crime in the City of Brotherly Love is featured in the January 2022 issue of the magazine History Today. His first book, Making the Early Modern Metropolis, Culture and Power in Philadelphia, 1682-1764, is scheduled for publication in the summer of 2022 from the University of Virginia Press. So congratulations in advance, Professor Johnson. And the title of his talk tonight is Dreaming of Lubberland, Idleness and Industry in the British Atlantic World. The talk will last like 35-40 minutes, and then we'll have a question and answer period. You can either raise your hands or write your question in the chat box. Okay, without further ado, Professor Johnson.
Okay, thank you, Professor Tamarsal. Thank you very much to ASAP for hosting the talk. I'm very excited. Thank you also everyone who's attending, especially on a Friday evening. It's very much appreciated. Maybe I was hoping before I could begin, and let me see if I can share my screen here, just to say very quickly sort of what the talk, where it's coming from. So the talk I'm going to give is kind of a very preliminary sketch of ideas that are related to a new book project. And so it's a little bit rough, and again, preliminary. And so I very much appreciate your criticisms and comments. I should say that the focus here on sort of literature, utopian literature, or fantasy literature is not the focus of the book. So for the sake of the talk, I'm using this sort of popular literature as a sort of lens to address larger questions about ideas about work, non-work, and ideas about industry and sort of how that changes over time from sort of medieval Europe to the early Americas. So that's, so it's again, in a very, I've just started working on the book in terms of writing. So again, any thoughts that you might have are very appreciated. I'm going to try to stay reasonable in terms of time. So I'm hoping to not go over. I don't know if someone, you know, if it gets close to the end, please let me know. Okay, so, and also I hope there is time for questions. If people have questions about the images in terms of the PowerPoint, please let me know also. This image is a famous painting from Peter Bruegel, the Elder, from 1567, and it is called The Land of Cockaigne. Okay, so I'll start with the talk. In a collection of essays published in 1760, the agricultural writer Jared Eliot complained that some people in New England, quote, will enter into no new scheme, nor take up any other business than what they have been inured to, unless you can promise mountains of gold, and that the colony that engages in it shall immediately be turned to Lubberland. In 1766, Benjamin Franklin wrote that, quote, some folks seem to think they ought never to be easy till England become another Lubberland, where 'tis fancied the streets are paved with penny rolls, the houses tiled with pancakes, and chickens ready roasted cry, come eat me. Almost 20 years later, Franklin claimed that the new United States was, quote, the land of labor, and by no means what the English call Lubberland, and the French cocaine, where the streets are said to be paved with half-pecked loaves, the houses tiled with pancakes, and where the fowls fly about, ready roasted, crying, come eat me. Though they all reference the fictional Lubberland, or land of cocaine, I'll use these terms interchangeably throughout the talk for the sake of variation. They mean the same thing. The three works quoted above belong to very different genres and social contexts. Eliot's publication was a collection of essays on agriculture in New England, and the passage lamented colonists' reluctance to invest in projects of economic development. Franklin's first quote is from an anonymously published commentary in a newspaper called the London Chronicle, written in response to the English government's restrictions on grain exports at a time of hunger and popular protest in England. The second, almost identical quote from Franklin appeared in an essay published in Plassey, France, and was addressed to prospective immigrants to France, or to America, rather. So what might the relevance of Lubberland be to these very different texts and contexts? Most obviously, each uses the fantasy land as a device to criticize unrealistic expectations, specifically people's hope for a life of ease without labor. In the real world, the author suggests, there is no gain without risk, and there is no escaping the necessity of work. In these and other 18th century publications, references to Lubberland assumed readers' familiarity with a dream world whose origins date to the Middle Ages at the latest. Yet the 18th century deployment of Lubberland as a shorthand critique of lazy fantasies speaks to broader social and cultural shifts in the early modern British Atlantic world. Medieval versions of the utopia were not reducible to criticisms of idle dreams. Some scholars have argued that cocaine originated as a festive people's utopia, a world that embodied common people's desires while subverting dominant norms and prescriptions. A concurrent view that became more prominent during the Renaissance used Lubberland as an educational device that emphasized humanity's lust for instant gratification and an innate proclivity to sloth. In contrast to the carnivalesque utopia, this version of the dream world is a moralistic one, in which utopias like those of Lubberland epitomize the deadly sins of lust, gluttony, and sloth. While a particular view of human sloth and gluttony consistently informed references to cocaine between the 15th and 18th centuries, changing visions of the perfect world in England and the Atlantic world testify to profound social, economic, and cultural changes over the course of the early modern era. The European discovery of the New World, the Protestant Reformation, the expansion of agrarian and merchant capitalism, the English Revolution, and the growth of the English Empire in the decades after the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, all informed fantasy literature and popular culture in contradictory and competing ways. An ironically constant element of elite opinion in the early modern world was that popular customs were stubbornly resistant to change. In this view, culture belongs to a different temporal order. It moves glacially in contrast to the rapid pace of economic and technological change that characterize modernity. Rooting out beliefs and practices based on quote unquote errors, which was a consistent refrain of Enlightenment writers, was made particularly difficult by the incorrigibility of ordinary people. It could also be argued, however, that the durability of cultural traditions represents strategies of contestation during a period of change. The persistence and adaptation of traditional festive culture, whether in narratives or practices, is more than simply evidence for the stubbornness of traditional culture. They suggest different conceptions of work, time, pleasure, and therefore of what constitutes a good life. The formation of new ideas of progress in England and later the British Empire required the suppression of practices and ideas that did not accommodate these new ways of thinking and living. Contests over the meaning of idleness, who was idle, in other words, like different representations of the perfect world, help us understand how experience shapes values in contradictory and often surprising ways. According to medieval European authors, a feudal society was governed by a system of orders that were mandated by laws both divine and human. In a simplified version of antiquity's great chain of being, in which the terrestrial hierarchy mirrored that of the celestial world, medieval clergy developed a social theory of three orders, which consisted of those who fight, the nobility, those who pray, the clergy, and those who work, the peasantry. Interdependency did not mean equality, however. For many authorities, manual labor was a degrading condition to be avoided at all costs. It was a humiliating stain that could not be cleansed. The requirement to labor was importantly accompanied by a cultural association of the peasantry with rusticism and the vulgar, whose alleged stupidity was rooted in nature and who were therefore uneducable. For medieval chroniclers, the term rustic was synonymous with bondman or serf, and these were invariably illiterate and not too distant from beasts of burden in need of frequent bridling. Poets like John Gower portrayed the multitude as an unthinking force of nature, who when activated were like a flood or a raging fire that neither reason nor discipline could control. A related view, and this is important in terms of work, according to which the peasantry labored only in order to meet basic subsistence needs, fostered a prominent belief in hunger as an essential incentive to work. While famine in the Middle Ages was relatively rare, in a world in which strenuous labor and seasonal hunger were fundamental elements of existence, it is unsurprising that abundant food without toil were the primary features of utopian fantasy. Late medieval Cockaigne manuscripts composed in rhyming verse for purposes of recitation typically feature animals offering themselves for consumption, edible architecture, an absence of conflict, perpetual holidays in springtime weather, communal property, and sex without shame. Though the appeal of Cockaigne stories crossed social boundaries, the land possessed special appeal for peasants and laboring townfolk. In a 14th century English version of the narrative, not only was labor unnecessary, it was expressly prohibited. Within In a 14th century version, gentle people wanting to reach the country were required to labor in a pig pen up to one's ears in muck, i.e. manure, for 7 years before entrance was actually allowed. Within Lubberland itself, the ban on labor was decreed by God, for Cockaigne was, quote, the land of the Holy Ghost, where those who sleep longest earn the most. This parody of the Christian heaven was a fitting accompaniment to winter carnival festivals that took place before the fasting and austerity that accompanied Lent in the spring. However, some versions also functioned as satires that would come to characterize references to Lubberland between the 16th and 18th centuries. One Dutch text states that those who prefer drunkenness, philandering, and wantonness should go to the land of Cockaigne in a tongue-in-cheek desire to be rid of the country's idle population. Hans Sachs, the cobbler poet of Nuremberg, wrote in his 1530 poem called The Sluggard's Land of a place that only lazy people understand. The work contains all the standard elements of Cockaigne, though at the end of the tale, a moral for children is appended, according to which the lesson of Sluggard's Land is that a love of ease leads eventually to greed and unhappiness. A Dutch prose text from a few decades later states that lazy daydreamers are treated like noblemen in Cockaigne, and that honor, virtue, honesty, civility, and wisdom were completely absent in the fantasy land. By this time, with the aid of the printing press, more suited to moralizing and didacticism than oral cultural transmission, portrayals of the topsy-turvy country of Lubberland were directed primarily towards a literate urban audience for whom the peasant's paradise represented the worst of humanity. Though the vision of a society of three orders and a dominant view of idleness persisted into the Renaissance, social and economic changes increasingly challenged such views. commercial and industrial development in the urbanized Low Countries, and the rise of agrarian capitalism in the English countryside, in which the figure of the yeoman played a leading role, increasingly complicated a neat distinction between clergy, aristocracy, and peasantry. The growth of market towns and the creation of new crafts similarly made the traditional rural-based imaginary unsustainable. Popular literature, aided by the printing press, reflected these changes. In the Low Countries, satires criticized urban merchant elites, as well as the laziness, incompetence, and drunkenness of the poor. Such works deployed allegorical figures and humorous dialogues to celebrate producers, corporate harmony, and Christian charity. It was also in the later Middle Ages that the figure of the virtuous plowman emerged in English popular culture. William Langland's Pierce Plowman, an allegorical epic composed in the 1370s, was a foundational work in the creation of a literary tradition that persisted through the 18th century, and even 19th here, as we see from the image. Suggestive, though cryptic, evidence of the figure of Pierce Plowman was shown during the Great Rebellion of 1381, a massive rising across large parts of England. According to some accounts, the radical priest and rebel leader John Ball expressed a phrase that became a motto in peasant revolts throughout late medieval Europe, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman. The ordinary plowman, as the ideal Christian in search of spiritual truth, became a theme in literary history, from Langland in the 14th century to John Bunyan's 17th century Pilgrim's Progress and beyond. The image here, as I state, is from William Morris's novella of 1887, A Dream of John Ball. A number of chroniclers blame the dissident priest John Wycliffe for the 1381 revolt. In the 1370s, Wycliffe had attacked a number of practices in the church and urged the withholding of taxes from Rome. He also advocated the translation of the Bible and was subsequently driven from Oxford University. His followers, known as Lollards and based largely in the lower clergy and literate craftspeople, maintained an underground existence through the 15th century and right up into the Protestant Reformation in the 16th. Clandestinely circulating Lollard dialogues continued to criticize the church while arguing for popular literacy and the translation of scripture. A crucial element in Lollard tracts, also evident in works celebrating the honest plowman, were representations of the clergy, especially itinerant friars who begged for alms, as particularly idle. According to the historian J.C. Davis, a key element distinguishing the classical utopia from Cockayne or Lubberland texts is the former's authoritarian character. Like a number of scholars, Davis sees utopian works as prefiguring the totalitarian societies of the 20th century. Thomas More's foundational utopia is, in this view, a place in which individuals surrender their individuality and freedoms as citizens in exchange for the defense of freedoms, a protection from uncertainty and change as subjects in a well-ordered totalitarian society. Yet utopia also offered a powerful critique of contemporary English society, as well as a major challenge to conventional views of labor and education. The first half of Utopia consists of the character Raphael Hythloday's observations on English law and economy. While the legal system unjustly sentenced people to death for thefts committed out of desperation, large numbers of people were ejected from their lands and homes as a result of the enclosure movement. England's growing exportation of wool to the Low Countries led many farmers to convert their lands from arable to pasture, a much less labor-intensive form of agriculture that consequently increased unemployment and led to the depopulation of manors as well as villages. This was the context in which Hythloday famously claimed that, quote, "Your sheep that used to be so meek and eat so little, now they are becoming so greedy and wild that they devour human beings themselves, as I hear." The concept of idleness also figured prominently in Utopia. Yet according to Hythloday, those inclined to idleness were not peasants needing correction, nor were they monks of the mendicant orders. Rather, the idle were those who enclosed lands and parasitically lived off the labor of others. Evoking the producerist ideology of the Low Country satires in England's plowman tradition, More claimed that the most virtuous people in society were the farmers, artisans, and laborers without whom the Commonwealth could not exist. However, while utopians highly valued work, labor was performed in moderation. No one worked from morning till night as if they were, quote, a beast of burden, end quote. Only 6 hours of the day were devoted to labor. The rest were hours of freedom, generally given to intellectual activity, especially reading. More's emphasis on learning and literacy was indicative of a broader impulse of educational reform, prominent among fellow humanists like Desiderius Erasmus and John Colet. More's Commonwealth of Utopia was, of course, a mental exercise intended for others of the Republic of Letters. It was not a plan for a real social order. More would be executed by Henry VIII in 1535, not for his radical social and political views, of which he didn't actually have, but because of his refusal to acknowledge Henry's new Church of England. More was himself not averse to the use of torture, and he famously claimed that he would rather see Utopia burned before it was translated in English for popular consumption. Yet, the idea that labor was a foundation of national prosperity gradually gained adherence as a Commonwealth discourse, soon associated with the Reformed religion, came to pervade English social and political thought. The creation of a new national church in the middle decades of the 16th century was accompanied by major social upheavals, most prominently in the anti-enclosure rioting known as Kett's Rebellion. Protestant humanists, known collectively as Commonwealth men, blamed popular turbulence on rapacious yeomen and landlords. A very different response to social unrest was provided by Thomas Smith, a scholar who would be a key figure in England's recolonization of Ireland in the 1570s. Smith's discourse of the commonweal of this realm of England innovatively argued for domestic industrial development and economic protectionism to combat rising prices. While the Commonwealth men blamed England's social ills on the covetousness of those with economic power, Smith argued that since avarice was an ineradicable part of human nature, the desire for economic gain could be harnessed for the good of the Commonwealth. Though it would not be published until later in the 16th century, historians of early modern England see Smith's text as signaling a crucial turning point in English society and culture. Agricultural expansion, the creation of new industries, and trade with continental Europe fueled a growing literary culture of improvement for an increasingly literate population. The expansion of domestic industries did not stem inflation or the growth of a large, unemployed and landless population, however. Ideas of enterprise soon fused with utopian visions of New World bounty and arguments for the creation of an English empire. The geographer Richard Hakluyt, who as a young man was fascinated with narratives of European exploration, became Elizabethan England's most vocal propagandist for the establishment of American colonies. In a 1584 memorandum to Queen Elizabeth, Hakluyt claimed that Western colonies would establish England's greatness, revive the national economy, and provide employment for the vast numbers of English unemployed. In 1589, Hakluyt almost published his popular Voyages and Discoveries, a part fact and part fiction collection of exploration narratives that was updated and continuously published well into the 17th century. Hakluyt's entertaining representation of exotic lands, some of which resembled a prelapsarian Eden, influenced writers and politicians like Francis Bacon. In addition to being England's foremost advocate of modern scientific methods, Bacon was also an investor in London's Virginia Company, the joint stock venture that founded the colony of Virginia. In the utopia New Atlantis, Bacon created the island nation of Bensalem, located somewhere in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of Peru, which was ruled by a benevolent technocracy who belonged to an institution of science called Solomon's House. Though heavily influenced by More's utopia, Bacon's perfect society was a hierarchical monarchy, and his posthumously published narrative lacked any discussion of popular education and very little about the culture of this fantasy world. Suggestively, however, New Atlantis's American setting was given considerably more attention than that in More's utopia. Evidence for Bacon's interest in natural philosophy, as well as the growing availability of knowledge about the New World. And Bacon wrote New Atlantis in the same years that England established permanent colonies in America. Representations of the New World as an actually existing land of natural plenty in popular ballads oftentimes encouraged common people to emigrate. By this time, ballads were regularly published as broadsides and hung in taverns where they were sung to popular tunes. So this image here is a sort of typical one. News from Virginia recounted the dramatic story of the Sea Venture, the supply ship headed for Jamestown, Virginia, whose wreck on the island of Bermuda famously inspired Shakespeare's The Tempest. London's lottery urged ordinary English people to settle Virginia in a land of individual opportunity and national glory. The zealous Puritan used a religious discourse to encourage smiths, shoemakers, and weavers to fly to America where, quote, psalms shall be our music, and the godly could enact their spiritual zeal in perfect freedom. If it was now generally known that America was not exactly an earthly garden, its natural bounty and liberties promised settlers material comfort as well as the honor of advancing the English and Protestant cause. The satirical cockane also made its way into the American ballad. The second stanza of Summons to New England speaks of New World abundance, but it was freedom to establish a pure church that constituted the song's refrain. However, Summons was in fact an anti-Puritan comedy. Puritans were a, quote, putrefidian sect of rabble-rousing extremists. And while the second stanza boasted of Lubberland like plenty in America, as the ballad proceeds, we are informed that in New England, there were no festival days or church gatherings. Cockane's festive culture was completely absent. Yet, as in Lubberland, there was no social order in the Puritan paradise. Radical Protestant liberty in America was in fact anarchic licentiousness, and the New England church would best function as a prison for the dregs of English society. Ballads like Summons to New England drew on the satirical Lubberland tradition to express a desire to be rid of a troublesome population, projected in this case not onto lazy people, but rather to extremist killjoys like the Puritans. If by the 1650s, both Lubberland and Thomas More's Utopia constituted no places prominent in English culture, in the 1640s, the prospect of perfecting English society seemed to many to be a real possibility. A major conflict between King Charles I and Parliament that exploded into civil war in the 1640s produced novel challenges to conventional views of idleness, work, and the ideal society. The breakdown of the state's ability to censor publication resulted in a cultural revolution in which radical religious, social, and political ideas flourished in an unprecedentedly free press. The defeat, trial, and execution of the king in 1649 was followed by the abolition of the House of Lords and the establishment of an English republic. According to literary critic Amy Boesky, the profusion of utopian literature published during the English Revolution was unequaled until early 19th century France. A crucial feature of radical religious writing, as well as some utopias, was the questioning of traditional orthodoxies concerning human nature and especially common people's right and ability to preach and interpret scripture. Unlettered preachers, importantly including women, argued for the democratization of church organization. Some believed making an ideal commonwealth would usher in the second coming of Christ. Religious independence fused traditional hostility to university learning with Renaissance ideas of a wider system of education. Demands for religious independence, in keeping with new ideas of liberty of conscience, led activists like Catherine Chidley to go even further and challenge patriarchal authority. These unorthodox ideas fed into different ideas about the nature of property and labor, which also flourished in this revolutionary environment. Gerard Winstanley, leader of the Digger or True Leveler movement, developed a theory of history according to which the privatization of land as well as knowledge among a privileged few had led to the dispossession of common people. The claim that it was landlords and employers who were idle was not new, but Winstanley went significantly further than earlier writers in his celebration of agricultural labor as a righteous and indeed godly activity. Winstanley's commoner background differentiated him from previous social critics. He was further distinguished by his attempt to put his theories into practice by establishing true leveler communes across England. By the time he wrote his Utopia, the Law of Freedom in a Platform, his communes had been repressed by hostile landlords as well as locals, and other religious sectaries had also been repressed by the new Commonwealth government. In his Utopia, the Law of Freedom in a Platform, it is therefore tinged with bitterness, and it essentially exhorts the new leader, Oliver Cromwell, to create a true Commonwealth. While he argued for a return to the origins of human society in his call for the abolition of property and access to land, Winstanley was, however, remarkably progressive in his demands for scientific inquiry, mass literacy, and Republican form of government. By this time, however, the only group to survive into the mid-1650s in terms of these new groups that emerge in the 1640s are, as most of us will be familiar with, a group called the Quakers, who would play a key role in social as well as religious thought and activism into the 17th and 18th centuries. Similar to the mechanic preachers of the 1640s, and indeed to anti-clerical lollards of the 15th and 16th centuries, Quakers attacked the learned clergy's monopolization of education and knowledge. Though they denied critics who claimed they shared affinities with controversial feminists, Quaker ideas were undoubtedly influenced by the writings of the German mystic and family of love founder, Hendrik Nicholas, whose utopian treatise Terra Passus was translated and published in England in the revolutionary year of 1649. In a last gasp of utopian and millenarian thinking, in 1659, the Quaker Edward Billing envisioned a country of religious and legal equality, where there was no capital punishment, with prison reforms and the abolition of servile tenures and other reforms. In 1660, the monarchy was restored in England under Charles Stuart II, bringing a definitive end to the dreams of utopian change that had flourished in the 1640s and that briefly resurfaced at the end of the 1650s. The demise of revolutionary hopes in the real world did not mean the end of utopian literature, however. Restoration era utopias, of which there were many, outlined perfect social orders and monarchies in more or less explicit critiques of the anarchic and licentious revolutionary era. Almost invariably, they drew on traditional images of people's turbulent and seditious nature, and therefore of the necessity for severe discipline and institutional power. Also increasingly prominent were more detailed representations of the Americas, both as settings for fictional worlds and, importantly, as a place of ethnographical interest regarding non-European humanity. An anonymous utopia published in the year of the Restoration, titled New Atlantis, was a continuation of Bacon's unfinished work of the same name and typified the reactionary culture of the age. The 1660 Atlantis was a model of order and discipline, a stark contrast to an England of previous decades in which every, quote, enthusiast did, quote, what was right in his own eyes. Since human nature was frail and more prone to evil than good, absolutist monarchical rule, characterized by severe laws, embodied the perfect form of government. Utopias set in republics in which agrarian laws limited economic inequality, and this was a reference to another famous utopia, James Harrington's Oceana, were, in this view, diametrically opposed to the ideal society. It is no accident that Bacon provided the inspiration for a few Restoration utopias. If much fiction, utopias included, treated the radicalism of the revolutionary era with satire and cynicism, the continuing fashion of plans for social betterment took on a distinctively moderate, if not conservative, cast. Post-Restoration improvement was embodied in the Baconian Royal Society of London, chartered by Charles II in 1662. Of course, the Royal Society still exists today. Improvement after the Restoration involved not the perfection of society, but efforts to enhance human happiness through sensible reforms grounded in empirical research. Perhaps unsurprisingly, reformers had little time for idle fictions. The founder of political arithmetic, William Petty, boasted that he expressed himself only in terms of numbers, weights, and measures, and discarded wholly, quote, superlative words and intellectual arguments, end quote. Importantly, a new science of statistics that involved advanced measurements of time, space, value, and people objectified and instrumentalized the population. The people, as a concept, had become an economic rather than political category, as the principle of commonweal gave way to that of the public good. One result of the new disciplines of political economy and statistics was a major revaluation of England's laboring population. The decades after 1650 saw England's demographic explosion of the previous century level off, while real wages climbed for the first time in more than a century. Instead of an idle population that drained the nation's resources, new arguments, Petty and others advanced the claim that laboring people were in fact the strength of the nation. New arguments advocating adequate wages competed with traditional ideas concerning the need to keep wages low to incentivize workers through hunger to labor industriously. Most notoriously, Bernard Mandeville argued in Fable of the Bees that the selfish pursuit of individual gain benefited the public by encouraging conspicuous consumption and therefore economic development. Yet high wages and free schools were dangerous to the national interest, for consumption and education among the lower orders bred dissatisfaction with their subordinate status. Though Mandeville's was an extreme case, the old idea of basic needs as a necessary motivator to industry took more sophisticated form in the mercantilist theory of utility of poverty, which argued that poverty actually acted as a stimulus to the growth of exports. Planners' desire to maintain a sufficient laboring population at home did not mean, however, the abandonment of colonies in the Americas. The importance of colonial goods to the English economy increased dramatically after 1660, and economic writers increasingly argued that English felons, Irish rebels, captive Africans, and Native Americans would better constitute the colonial labor force. It would, of course, be enslaved Africans that made up the overwhelming majority of workers on British plantations, and the formation of racialist social theory provided important justifications for this reliance. Incipient racial theories justifying enslavement were buttressed by new ways of counting and monetizing populations, while celebrations of an exceptionalist British commitment to free trade stimulated the Atlantic trade in captive humans. The flexibility of early modern social theory is indicated by the fact that ideas about race and idleness could contradict one another with relative ease depending on the context. In 1649, William Bullock complained that English servants in Virginia were an idle, slothful people. In subsequent decades, English authors regularly accused the Irish of being uniquely idle and slothful. Africans, by contrast, were innately industrious, and therefore uniquely suited to plantation labor. However, colonial laws that institutionalized chattel slavery during the same years invariably claimed that since Africans were an idle, slothful people, they therefore needed coercion and regular physical correction. Visitors to the growing sugar colonies of the Caribbean described the unique characteristics and cultures of enslaved Africans, while simultaneously inserting them into a discourse of capital expenditure involving new industrial techniques of production intended to maximize efficiency and profit. Importantly, ethnic categories were as important as racial ones in 17th century representations of the industriousness, or rather idleness, of colonial workers. The historian Hilary MacDonald Beckles has noted that in the 17th century, English masters in Barbados valued Scottish laborers most highly. The Irish, by contrast, were seen as lazy, drunk, and worst of all, Catholic. By the mid-18th century, there existed in the British West Indies a distinctive poor white subculture termed redlegs and redshanks by their English oppressors. By this time, a poor white subculture had also emerged in North America. In his 1728 History of the Dividing Line between Virginia and North Carolina, William Byrd wrote that North Carolina, quote, approaches nearer to the description of Lubberland than any other, by the great felicity of the climate, the easiness of raising provisions, and the slothfulness of the people. Byrd was not alone in commenting on the marriage of laziness and luxury on the Carolina frontier. Wretched ignorance, a lack of laws and religion, failure to properly manage the land, and extended week-long bouts of drinking alcohol characterized North Carolina culture in the view of civilized travelers. The real-world enactment of cocaine in America produced degradation and dissolution among the people, evidence of which continued when missionaries noted backcountry settlers' resistance to conversion during the Great Awakening of the mid-18th century. The historical use of idleness as a disease of the lower orders that appeared in post-restoration concepts like Lubberland, as well as the utility of poverty, did not go unchallenged. If one metropolitan trope concerning the colonies was that a lack of social order led to idleness and immorality, stories of masters' oppression told a rather different story. Ballads like the Trepanned Maiden and the Poor Unhappy Transported Felon recounted the brutalities of colonial servitude in a dystopian language of material deprivation and cruel overwork. If political economists objectified human labor, it is telling that critics of exploitative working conditions invariably referred to masters' inhumanity in the popular form of the ballad. If idleness served as a crucial keyword in the long 18th century, the assertion that masters and mistresses lacked basic human qualities served as a significant rejoinder. Lubberland could also serve critical ends. Superficially, the 1685 ballad, An Invitation to Lubberland, which is pictured here, is a traditional lampoon of fantasies of the lazy life. Sung to the tune of Billy and Molly, the ballad described the fruitful country of Lubberland. Ruled in peace by the king of knaves and the queen of sluts, the street of Lubberland were paved with pudding pies, powdered beef, and bacon. Fowl and fish tumbled in the dishes, rivers and ponds ran with fine wine, hunger was unknown. Every day was a holiday filled with music, and all, of course, were free from the need to labor. Yet when read in conjunction with stories of colonial oppression in the large numbers of pamphlets promoting emigration published after 1660, Invitation to Lubberland looks like a different kind of satire. On coming to power, King Charles offered American lands, what are called proprietary colonies, to a number of benefactors. Hence, New York was given to Charles' brother, James, hence Duke of New York, hence New York, and the new colonies of Carolina, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania were established. Proprietors published countless pamphlets emphasizing the considerable freedoms and material rewards to be obtained in America. The ballads claim that everyone in Lubberland was a freeholder, an assertion that wouldn't have made sense in the medieval context, lends credence to this interpretation, as does the fact that the song urges those free to cross the seas to sail to Lubberland, 2,000 leagues from Dover. An Invitation to Lubberland was in fact a satire of colonial propaganda. The New World paradise promised by proprietors was, it was implied, as fanciful as medieval tales of cocaine. The work of Jonathan Swift arguably constituted the peak of Augustan satire, and it is suggestive that two of Swift's most important works, Gulliver's Travels and A Modest Proposal, were parodies of the Utopia and the Improvement pamphlet, respectively. While Gulliver spares no one in its dim view of human nature, A Modest Proposal takes specific aim at the projectors who claim to work in the public interest, in particular those concerned with colonies like Ireland. Since the author of the pamphlet argues, a large number of Irish children cannot be employed in agriculture or manufactures, they might serve better as, quote, a most delicious, nourishing, and wholesome food, whether stewed, roasted, baked, or boiled, and I make no doubt that it will equally serve in a fricassee or ragout. While frequent references to methods of calculation serve as indictments of a contemporary rage for figures abstracted from their human effects, also crucial is Swift's discourse of grotesque consumption. To devour had a far wider application in the early modern world than it does today, and was often used in protests against excessive rents and enclosure, as well as against antisocial market practices like engrossing and forestalling. One could devour money and resources in much the same way that they devoured food. In addition to extending the logic of utility to its absurd conclusion, A Modest Proposal literalized a popular conception of dispossession in a cannibalistic anti-colonial satire. The desire to make rational use of people, time, and space that was a primary target of A Modest Proposal was, despite Swift's efforts, all-encompassing by the mid-18th century. The pervasiveness of anxieties over idleness was manifested in the workhouse movement and an increasingly severe corporal punishment for minor crimes in the American colonies as well as in England. This hostility was immortalized in the visual arts by William Hogarth in his Industry and Idleness engravings, a linked series of prints narrating the diverging lives of Tom Idle and Francis Goodchild. The story parallels popular criminal narratives of the day, in which idle games and minor infractions in youth eventually end up in serious crimes and ultimately public execution, of which we see an image here in the Hogarth series. Like other leading voices of the time, Hogarth in essence criminalizes a lack of industriousness, making law-breaking an inevitable consequence of the moral failing of laziness. Benjamin Franklin, as a real-world Francis Goodchild, embodied the ideal of industry in the 18th century. Max Weber famously used Franklin's philosophy of avarice as the archetype for bourgeois asceticism, the peculiar ethic at the center of his Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. It is therefore unsurprising to find the author of works like The Way to Wealth castigating lazy ne'er-do-wells' hope to receive something for nothing in references to Lubberland. Franklin's 1766 reference to Lubberland came while the famous printer and politician was in London as a colonial representative. The failure of wheat crops in much of Europe in that year led to popular demonstrations and bread riots in England. Crowd actions pushed the government to impose an emergency embargo on the exportation of wheat from any British port to foreign lands. Though in his writings between the 1730s and 1750s, Franklin often identified as an honest city artisan, in his London Chronicle article, he claimed to be a farmer who simply desired a fair price for the grain he produced. Opposing the just interests of the farmers was Lord Mob, who seized corn on the way to market and sold it for less than market price or simply gave it away. Limiting the exportation of grain in effect constituted a tax for the maintenance of the poor, a practice that fostered dependency and sloth and led to more rather than less poverty. Though England's system of poor relief was relatively generous, according to Franklin, there is no, quote, there is no country in the world in which the poor are more idle, dissolute, drunken, and insolent. In addition to demanding a less generous system of public relief, Franklin hoped that St. Monday and St. Tuesday, customary days of recovery and leisure after day of Sunday dissipation, would cease. Okay, so I'm going to skip over quickly Franklin's other letter that was referenced in Lubberland in terms of basically discouraging people from emigrating to America because they have ideas about America, for example, that you're given land or you're given enslaved people who will work for you. America, as he argues, is essentially a land of hard work. It's the land of labor. The utopian genre underwent a major transformation in the middle of the 18th century. Works like David Hume's idea of a perfect commonwealth exemplified utilitarian rationalism. Hume's anti-democratic utopian republic was a major influence on James Madison, author of the US Constitution. Arguably the most innovative utopian vision was that developed by the American Herman Husband, whose fusion of biblical prophecy and populist laborism produced a radically democratic New Jerusalem, as he called it. As Husband was aware, not since the 1640s had a system of government based on popular sovereignty been actually possible. But his plan for New Jerusalem was a rearguard action, an ultimately unsuccessful attempt to create an alternative to Madison's aristocratic republic. But if Enlightenment utopias turned against the misanthropic cynicism of Restoration-era fantasies, they tended to share the 18th century obsession with idleness. The best foil to Franklin's and others' dismissal of Lubberland can therefore be found not in fantasy literature, but in the mystical social criticism of Quakers like John Woolman of New Jersey. For Woolman, it was precisely the ceaseless striving advocated by improvers like Franklin that made people miserable. While enslavers lived in luxury off the labor of their fellow human beings, free people were constantly at work, abused alcohol, and ruined their health for the sake of material gain. Woolman advocated instead honest though moderate work while placing great emphasis on education and the cultivation of one's intellectual faculties. For Woolman, the pursuit of outward wealth made impossible what really mattered, which was inward peace. Though his view of labor and industry was not the mainstream one, his combining of social activism and intellectual engagement would be an inspiration for countless reformers, utopians included, in subsequent decades. Okay, and just to finish up, dreams of a world without work, as well as fears over idleness, continued, of course, in the 19th and 20th centuries and are still with us today. From Harry McClintock's 1928 song, Big Rock Candy Mountain, I assume some of you are familiar with the song from the Coen brothers film, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, from I think the late 1990s, to more recent books like Aaron Bastani's 2020 Fully Automated Luxury Communism, dreams of liberation from the drudgery of everyday existence persist into the 21st century. In terms of fantasy literature, however, it is notable that while popular culture is saturated with dystopian works of catastrophe, the utopian vision, whether realistic or fantastical, remains on the margins. Moreover, archaic views of humanity's natural inclination towards sloth are also still very much with us. In the summer of 2021, David Nykerk, who helped design Amazon's warehouse system, told the New York Times that Amazon founder and owner Jeff Bezos' belief that people were inherently lazy shaped the company's policies. According to Nykerk, Bezos said that it is, quote, our nature as humans is to expend as little energy as possible to get what we want or need, end quote. Hence Amazon's short-term employment model, its refusal to guarantee wage increases and constant monitoring of workers to guarantee high rates of productivity, and of course also its frequent accidents and high rates of employee turnover. I would argue that the fact that the meaning of work and time continue to preoccupy us in the 21st century testifies not to a historical problem of human nature and sloth, but rather to competing conceptions of what constitutes meaningful work, the good life, and the proper use of time. Only time will tell us whether recent developments, for example, what some are calling the Great Resignation in the US, will constitute a serious challenge to the current reign of industry and overwork, or whether that is simply more utopian thinking. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor. Now we are ready for the questions.
All right, lay it on me.
I think Özge Hoca was the first. Özge, you're muted. Yeah.
Well, it was not a hand raise, it was a clapping,
Okay.
but what I was thinking as the professor was exemplifying these books, David Graeber had this book a few years back, Bullshit Jobs, and well, I was just, and this is just a comment and not a question, but I was thinking of that book and about meaningful work and, you know, how you, yeah. So, yeah, that's it.
Yeah, no, that I've actually, that book came out of an article that he wrote. I've actually assigned that article in class before. I don't remember exactly when it came out, but the book was sort of a spin-off on that. And yeah, I think that is, you know, I think that's very much worth reading now when we think of like sort of contemporary things, like when we think of work. I mean, I think because, and correct me if I'm wrong, sort of the basic argument is that David Graeber, who was an anthropologist who passed away recently, gave this story about meeting, he was at a party and he met like, you know, some corporate lawyers. I don't know why he was at this party, but he met these corporate lawyers, and the sort of basic idea was he started talking to these people who said, like, you know, what do we ask people when we meet them? Well, what do you do? Right. So our identity is very much tied up with our work. And so, you know, he would tell people that I'm an anthropologist, and people would tend to say, oh, that's very interesting. And then, you know, he asked them what they do, and they said they're corporate lawyers. And he was like, you know, that's not very interesting. And the thing that surprised him was they agreed with him. And they said, no, it's not interesting. We don't like our work. Our work is completely meaningless. Not to say that it actually is, but the sort of idea, I think, of his argument, and again, I haven't read the book, is that, you know, about sort of work that not only doesn't serve any social function, which I think since the sort of COVID outbreak, we've come to appreciate probably somewhat more, is not only not serving a sort of social function, but not finding any sort of fulfillment and meaningfulness. Yeah, I mean, I would encourage people to read his thoughts about that, definitely.
We have another hand who registered by the name Ayşe Çeliko, but looks like a gentleman. You're muted, sir.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm on my wife's account. I only realized that just now. So my name is actually William Coker. I'm in CCI at Bilkent. So first, I wanted to thank Dan for his talk. And I also want to apologize for coming a bit late. And I hope that my question is not something that you've already answered in the first part, in the bit of the talk that I missed, but I suspect it's probably not, so I'll ask it. So I was wondering, when you were talking about all of these early modern 17th century utopians, and especially those who came from, who were part of one of these religious traditions like the Diggers, or these sects, low church sects that were very antinomian, how much do we know about the formation of those groups in relation to class formation, and in particular about how many of the people who were in those groups were either themselves people who had left the countryside because of enclosures, or the descendants of those who had left the countryside because of enclosures, or who had fallen into debt as a result of the economic process that the enclosures began? I mean, do historians have kind of empirical data, or is there knowledge on the connection, historical connection between these two things?
Yeah, no, I didn't address that. It's a good question. To the part of like the sort of, people dispossessed through enclosure, I'm not aware of information regarding that. There is a lot of literature on sort of the cultural and intellectual history of places that go back in terms of where anti-clericalism was very prominent. So like the Lollard sort of criticisms of church corruption going back to the late 14th century, to sort of more antinomian radical Protestant ideas were very prominent. So there's community studies that sort of trace this sort of history from, really, criticism of, friars in the church, and, idleness really as a sort of concept in terms of places that were very receptive to radical Protestant ideas. Where that gets kind of complicated is, where I mentioned sort of the Quakers, because one thing that's different about Quakers is that they come primarily from Northern England, right? Which is not the sort of traditional Southeastern hotbed of radical Protestantism. So that's an interesting question that I don't know that there's an answer for, that I certainly don't have. But the short answer is yes. I mean, people have traced the sort of history from people where at least, and in terms of class background, sort of Lollardy ideas before the Reformation initially were coming from sort of educated priests who were sympathetic to this idea. There was official repression, and then, through the 15th and then into the 16th century, these were mainly like lower clergy and skilled artisan, right? So what you would call like middling, literate people who found these ideas interesting.
Thank you.
And I think we have next Colleen Kennedy Carpot.
Hi, Dan. Thank you very much for that wonderful talk. I'm here with a couple of budding historians, and their question is actually about the illustrations that you've been using and where you have sourced some of those images. And I'll take that off camera. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, there were a few of them. I mean, so the first one, as I mentioned, is from Bruegel the Elder, who, if there are early modernists out there, you know of him. If you are not, he's amazing, and you should look at other things that he has painted. Other sort of ballads are like actual real ballads from the 17th century. And so these would be like songs that would be printed like a poster. And then they would be put like on the wall, usually a tavern wall. And then it would say under the title, you can sing this song to a popular song that everybody knows. And then so you would have someone who either plays a fiddle or perhaps plays a guitar. Everyone could sing along, or, you know, if they could read, or you could just sort of hum along. And it was a way of like entertaining, like, you know, collective entertainment. Other ones, I'm not sure. The New Atlantis one was actually, I think, from the New Atlantis. The other ones, I don't know. I just Google searched them and then copied and pasted them in because I thought they were relevant.
Okay, thanks very much. That's really cool information with the music.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Any other?
And Dan, can you tell us more about the project?
Sure. So the project is actually not about utopias. The way I see it, and I've have drafts of the introduction for each chapter, and so each chapter will start with an anecdote of a utopia. And so it uses one of these stories that I sort of went through in the talk to present a sort of vision of society at the time. So right now I have like the first chapter is Thomas More's Utopia, looking back to the late medieval period, and then I will talk about Cockaigne in the chapter. And then each chapter sort of moves forward in time, beginning with a sort of utopia, but then, you know, in the book, there's a lot more, I guess, social history, which I know if you are literary scholars, you find fascinating, but which is why I didn't include it in the talk here. But basically, it's sort of a social and cultural history that is not focused on fantasy literature, but uses popular literature to sort of trace out these broader social and cultural changes. And so the second chapter will look at sort of Francis Bacon's New Atlantis. The third chapter looks at Gerard Winstanley and the Diggers. And then I go through, right, with sort of Enlightenment utopias, and then end with sort of the revolutionary era at the end of the 18th century.
I guess there are no more questions. It's late in the evening. So, oh, Hazal has a question. Yes, Hazal.
Hello, and thank you for this talk. I actually found it really relevant to our time today as well, during the pandemic and everything that's going on around the world. And I took some notes. I'm sorry if I'm all over the place. I would like to thank you for actually making these comments. And actually, there along the lines, I think you said this is not 100% quote. So the poor earn more money and they actually study. And along these lines, there's actually issues going on in other countries that people are failing to pay tuitions or going incredible debt to pay tuitions just to actually learn more about different occupations and stuff, so they don't have to labor in the sense that they have to use physical labor. I think that was this I'm sorry, I'm a bit all over the place. I think that was looked down upon during the time that you mentioned, and now I feel like it is still looked down upon, but it is because you go into that to study, and it's still in a way it is looked down upon to work, in a sense, work minimum wage jobs. But if someone tries to earn more knowledge and they want to go into a different occupation and they go into debt, also that debt is looked down upon. I kind of draw a line between the two, art today and the past. And you mentioned like laziness and moral breaking and laboring in a righteous way, and kind of still drawing a line with what Jeff Bezos said about warehouses and stuff. And there's been a couple of news articles about how inhumane his warehouses are. And again, like you said, I think we have to make a good life, work, and quality time. I think we have to describe that once again as a society. And I found it really interesting that, as you mentioned, identity is tied up with work. And it is interesting to see that we actually weren't able to move that far in terms of how we view work and how we view people and laborers. And thank you. I'm sorry it's a bit late and I'm all over the place, but thank you for this great talk. I'm really interested in what you wrote, and I will look forward to your project.
No, thank you. Thank you very much for the comments. I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I think in one sense, the question is you know, I think things have changed in some ways, but fundamentally they're still, you know, there's a question of values, and I think like the point of what do we choose to value, like what is important is somewhat sort of lays at the center of it. And so like I think like I hope like to show that things did change over time from, say, the late medieval period to the early modern period. Although, as you say, you know, things have happened slowly, and so even today, right, there are certain, I guess, prejudices against manual labor. You know, one of the sort of historical constants that I found, in addition to ideas about sort of idleness, is that people want their children to be educated so that they don't have to work in this way, right? Perhaps that they did. And so I think in one way it's a question of how do we again challenge sort of conventional ideas of what labor means. Does work mean getting paid money, or does it mean something else? And I think these are, yeah, obviously still open questions. Thank you for your comments.
Yes, I think we have Mr. Joshua Bartlett.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Yeah, Dan, thanks for a really interesting talk. I have a couple of questions, but since the project you're describing ends in the kind of revolutionary era, I'm not going to ask my what happened in the 19th century questions. But I wanted to go back to the section that of the project you were talking about, where these kind of theories of idleness start to converge with theories about race. And so we get the sort of the poor white figure that still has contemporary resonance, the sort of incoherent race theories about Africans. But I was curious if the work that you're doing here goes more into specifically how this discourse impacts relations with Native Americans and indigenous people, particularly as in the 18th century, as they become sort of more important as political allies and not just sort of a labor force or economic thing. So I don't know if there's more to say about that, or.
No, there is actually, and I kind of took out because when people start to talk about sort of African in these sort of contradictory ways about sort of African, idleness or industry, depending on who is writing what. English people had talked about Native Americans in a sort of earlier period. So the sort of early 17th century, when Jamestown is founded, and then when the New England colonies are founded, there is discussion, and you see this actually the same phrase, like an idle, slothful people, applied to Native Americans. The idea in that context usually has to do with land, right? And it has to do with the idea that they're not using land productively. And it also is gendered in the sense of, Native American men are lazy, when Native Americans, of course, have a different sort of, gendered system of labor, right? So it's Native American men who are hunting and fishing. This, from the English perspective, looks like idleness. And so that is very much the idea of sloth. In terms of the development of sort of racial theory in the 18th century, as the sort of ambivalence about Native American capacities continue into the 19th century, right? And so part of the larger project has to do with the ability of, or the perceived ability of groups to quote unquote improve, like can they learn stuff, right? And so by the late 18th century, the verdict from, of course, people like Thomas Jefferson, right, and these sort of Enlightenment figures is that Native Americans probably, the view is relatively more positive about them than it is about African people who by the late 18th, early 19th century are seen in sort of pseudo-scientific terms as being inferior. The idea is that Native Americans can still be civilized. They can still be made industrious. So that is in terms of the project, because it begins actually earlier with Native Americans with the English colonial project. And then towards the late 18th century, the sort of revolutionary period, it's still sort of a question. And then what you actually get, one text that I'm going to talk about, what's the author's name? I'm forgetting it. Who actually writes in a very contrarian way about, not in a Rousseauian way of romanticizing Native Americans, but actually saying that the Native American system of education is actually better for these reasons. And it's from this anti-federalist teacher, actually. And so the short answer is yes, that will be more sort of a part of the project.
If Mr. Bartlett, this was your last question, maybe we should move to Burçin Hoca.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this very interesting and thought-provoking survey of all these utopias, embracing the idea of enjoyment, idleness, and not working, perhaps. While going through all these examples, I was thinking about it. Today, perhaps we're too easily passing judgment on these wish fulfillment ideas. And I was just trying to recall in the Middle Ages and later on, even in the 19th century, working conditions were really tough, labor intensive. I immediately remembered even as late as the Victorian period, it's a torture to read the social history. You have 16-hour work days. Even in the mines, they don't even come up to have fresh air. They share the same bed because they sleep in turns. The field work is hard. And keeping all these things in our mind, perhaps seeing why laziness was such an important component of utopias, because they really didn't have enough time perhaps for leisure. Leisure was very, very limited. It was very, very work intensive. Today, Bacon, Thomas More in his Utopia is about 4 or 5 centuries ahead of his time. He's talking about limited hours of work. which is the standard today. But the standards of all these utopias are very tough. So perhaps it might be more just to view these utopias and how they dream about more leisure. Laziness is a luxury. Perhaps they never have time to enjoy. What would you think about these conditions? Today we have so many gadgets, so many technical things to help us out. All work hours are limited. And tying it up with the pandemic, we have lost our work hours. Now it has become 24/7. And we keep complaining about it. Perhaps we're having a taste of what it was like when these utopias were being written. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I think part of the argument is that we usually think of 19th century industrialization as sort of the founding of the sort of modern hourly sort of waged system, right? But what I would argue here is that, really, if we go back to the 17th century, is really when we see these new ideas about maximizing efficiency in terms of time and in terms of labor. That is where these sort of ideas come from. And then sort of going along with that, it is not, is sort of not particularly reflective about the people who are actually producing this, but it's how do you produce as much as possible in a rational way, right? And so it's not the Victorian age, although that's when we see sort of large scale industry develop, but sort of the seeds for that begin in an earlier period, right? And then I think you're also right, like if we think in terms of today, I mean, the only thing I would disagree with is, as you say, there is no sort of time off of work now. Like work hours have become limited through sort of negotiation over work, right? But now with the pandemic and work hours are like unlimited. And I wonder like about like the students who we teach who like emailing me on a Sunday and then expecting a response in like an hour. And it's like, it's Sunday. I'm not gonna like write to you on a Sunday. And then that seems like a really foreign, strange idea to them. Like how are they gonna conceptualize time in sort of a different way? I mean, I think the other thing is the sort of irony of technological progress in the sense of, when we think of the ideas that, in terms of like the post-World War II period in which technology was supposed to make life for everyone easier. It was supposed to make us work less because, we would have all this advanced technology, but that didn't happen. I mean, at least in the US, people work more than they ever have, right? Sometimes in, bullshit jobs, but nevertheless, they're still at the workplace or still have to be available, right? And that's part of the David Graeber argument, right? And so then the question becomes like, how do we get out of this conception of like, and most of us, like if we're academics, we're lucky because we have jobs that we like to do, right? But a lot of people don't have that luxury. And so then the question becomes, how do you intervene, right? And how do you try to convey, new ways of thinking about work, I guess. But yeah, I agree.
Well, any other questions? I guess not. Well, if not, thank you very much for your very interesting, inspiring talk. And I have to say, I think at this time of the semester where we're so busy, and at this time of the day, the last day of the week, and so late in the evening, I think most of us at least need a Lubberland to go and have some rest and take it easy and be lazy. So have a nice weekend and thank you once again. Bye-bye to all. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.